All right, let's get started. Once again, hello. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Will Penfield, and on behalf of Everbridge, I'm excited to present this webinar, Active Shooter Preparedness Survey, Key Findings and Best Practices. During the event, our speakers will discuss key findings from the Everbridge and EMS Joint Active Shooter Preparedness Survey, readiness best practices, and how technology can improve your organization's active shooter response. After the presentation, we will have a short Q&A session with our speakers. We encourage everyone to participate and ask questions during the webinar. You can submit your questions by typing in the questions widget and submitting to all panelists. Links to the slides and recording of the webinar will be sent out to all registrants in the next day or two. You can also look for a link to recordings for all of our webinars on everbridge.com under our resources section. And now I would like to introduce you to our speakers. First up, we have Imad Mouline, who is the Chief Technology Officer for Everbridge and is responsible for the company's product strategy and technology direction. He has more than 25 years of experience in developing large-scale, mission-critical systems. Imad is a regular presenter at industry, technology, and academic conferences, including the MIT Management and Business Continuity, BCM World, and the World Conference on Disaster Management, Cloud Connect, and the MIT CIO Symposium. He is frequently quoted in leading publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC News, Business Week, Forbes, and Information Week. Imad is a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has been awarded 4 U.S. patents. Following Imad, we will have Regina Phelps, who is an internationally recognized expert in the field of emergency management and continuity planning. Since 1982, she has provided and education speaking services to clients in 4 continents. She is founder of Emergency Management and Safety Solutions, a consulting company specializing in incident management, exercise design, and continuity and pandemic planning. Clients include many Fortune 500 companies. Ms. Phelps is a frequent top-rated speaker at well-known conferences, such as the Disaster Recovery Journal, CP&M, and the World Conference on Disaster Management. And now, without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Imad. Imad, you may begin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Will. Thank you, everybody who's joined us today. So it does feel like, certainly, that we hear about active shooter scenarios quite a bit more than we did in the past. So are they really on the rise, or is it just the fact that everybody knows about this information, given how quickly information spreads? Well, certainly, if we look at some FBI studies, it does look like over the last few years, active shooter incidents are indeed on the rise. So the data really does go ahead and confirm what we intuitively believe. So because of that, one of the things that we decided to do here at Everbridge, along with our partners at EMS, so Regina's firm, is a survey. So we went ahead and conducted an active shooter preparedness survey. And this is certainly, you may download the full research report. The research survey went out to more than 850 respondents, people who were responsible for security and emergency preparedness at a variety of businesses across multiple industries and vertical. And we asked questions about people's plans, their really determination, their ability to handle active shooter situations, and then asked them a little bit about the challenges that they faced. So over the next few slides, what we're going to do is just share with you some of the insights that we got back from you, the respondents, and then Regina will go ahead and give us some best practices, and then I'll go back and talk to you a little bit more about products and technology and how can they help specifically address those challenges that you've told us about in this survey. So let's start with really the basics. We didn't ask specifically around active shooter, but we did ask all of you, what are the top threats that your organization is preparing for? And we asked you to select all that apply. And interestingly enough, 2 of the top 3 have to do with workplace violence. So the top threat is active shooter situations. So 69% of organizations view active shooter as the top potential threat. And I'd like you to take a second look at the responses, and in number 3, at almost 62%, it's workplace violence. So again, this is 850 professionals. I'm sure many of you were respondents, and this is what you told us. So let's keep that in mind. That's the top threat. However, and this is the interesting disconnect, despite the fact that you're recognizing that this is a top threat, most organizations aren't sufficiently prepared. So if you take a look at all the ones who said not at all prepared, a little bit prepared, or only somewhat prepared, we're talking about 76% of you feel that you're not prepared well enough for an active shooter event. So interesting disconnect, and I'd love to start hearing from some of you as to why that is. You know it's an issue, but you're not prepared for it. So we drilled down a little bit more, not to use a pun here, but we asked how many of you run active shooter drills. And again, 60.4% said that you do not run active shooter drills at all. So no wonder you're certainly not feeling adequately prepared. So what else have we learned? So we asked that what are your biggest challenges for an active shooter incident that may be location specific, so in a particular building, in a particular area. And really these are some very interesting challenges that you told us about. And we're going to actually go into a couple of them in more detail a little bit later on. But let's start with the top challenge that you told us about. Right? Your top challenge is, 71% of you cited that communicating with impacted employees as your top challenge or concern. Okay? Now, again, another disconnect. 39% of you said that you do not have a communications plan in place for active shooters. So, big challenge, big concern, but no solution in place, no plan in place.
Let me first of all thank you very much, Imad, for sharing those insightful findings of the study and also the incredible number of disconnects that we heard about. It's my pleasure today to talk about the 7 things to do to prepare for an active shooter. And I'll tell you that when we first started our practice some 34 years ago, it would have never dawned on me that we would be dealing with this type of threat. And yet in the past 20 years, in our client population alone, we've had 47 murders. And these have been in all types of environments, all white collar, and in business parks and high rises. And to that end, we've done lots of work in the area of workplace violence, and now active shooter, of course, has fallen into that mix. So what I want to talk about today is really the connection of the two, workplace violence and active shooter, because they really do go hand in hand. Now, first of all, the active shooter definition, as you probably are very familiar with, is defined as an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a populated area. With workplace violence, the definition is much broader. This can include verbal threats, physical violence, use of weapons, and sometimes this workplace violence incident can actually lead to the active shooter. Think of those types of examples. That can be a terminated employee. It can be an employee who's involved in some sort of progressive discipline. It might be domestic violence coming into the workplace. It could be a disgruntled customer who has some known history with you. Or perhaps it's a contractor or a vendor who has a contract that's been terminated or something that's been canceled. Think about those. Those are all known to you in advance. As I go through my comments today, please think about the unknown and the known. The unknown shooter, that's San Bernardino, that's Orlando, and just yesterday in Vancouver, Washington, an active shooter situation in a Vancouver Walmart. Keep those two possibilities in mind as we walk through these presentations. So first of all, I'm going to talk about 7 things. And the first thing is to develop a workplace violence policy and plan. Now, The policy, first of all, has to be very clear. You have to clearly state, emphatically, what is covered under workplace violence. One of the concerns I have when I look at a lot of policies is they might use a word or a phrase called zero tolerance. Zero tolerance is something that you need to avoid because zero tolerance means zero tolerance. That means if somebody makes an offhanded remark, a careless joke, that actually considers underneath your policy. So be very clear whether you're talking about verbal, physical, use of weapons, and be explicit. Call out all prohibited behaviors. You also want to include in this policy what kind of sanctions or disciplinary actions are going to be used if indeed a person violates the policy. And then you want to make sure that you've actually posted this in all of your company locations so that everyone is familiar with the policy that you have in place. You also then want to consider two other things as part of the policy. How to report incidents so that when an employee is reading the policy, they can clearly see exactly how to report a threat they might have just heard or received themselves from someone. And they also need to know how incidents or threats are going to be actually investigated and followed up. We've talked to many people who have had concerns, anxieties about employees or vendors or customers, and yet they're afraid about how it's going to be handled, so they don't report it because they're afraid the employer might make it worse. The plan should also then detail a variety of things. It should talk clearly about how the company is going to handle all these threats and incidents. And when you look at that, one of the questions that we often are asked is, should we get a restraining order? Should the company get a restraining order, or maybe the individual? And there is no blanket yes or no to that question. And that is, it really depends. And that's not to skip the answer, but it really is to say it's complicated. What we encourage any of our clients who are really concerned about threats that they have received, either from employees, customers, contractors, or domestic violence, that they really engage the assistance of an organizational psychologist or a personality individual who can actually peel back this individual's personality and traits to see if that could be a threat. There have been numerous cases where companies have actually gotten restraining orders, and there's also been a case of violence almost immediately thereafter. Your plan should also include what your EAP, your Employee Assistance Program, can do for you. Do they provide counseling? Do they come on site? Do they spend time with families? Can they help in a situation of violence? And if they can't, please now find somebody who can, and you want to make sure that you include that in the plan so you could contact them at a moment's notice. Really building on what Imad was talking about is that communications are absolutely essential, and your communications team must be prepared with pre-written templates in all aspects of this crisis of an active shooter. That includes social media, 140 characters for Twitter, what you would post on many of your different platforms, as well as what you're going to place on your emergency notification system when you send out any of those emergency alerts. So you want to also, to that end, preload all communications onto your ENS, your emergency notification system, because you need to make sure that when this happens, you can immediately go out and begin to communicate. You also want to make sure that you've selected and trained a media spokesperson who is skilled in this very difficult and very delicate topic of workplace violence and active shooter. Secondly, on my list, you need to select and train a violence assessment team. Now, many of our clients in the world of incident management have an overall incident assessment team, and that indeed may be the similar group, but it may be a special group. The likely candidates that would be in a threat assessment team are ones that would certainly come to your mind: human resources and security, safety, facilities, legal, maybe workers' comp and training, employee assistance, somebody from administration or management. These are individuals who should always have a primary and an alternate for every role, and they should clearly understand what their task is. Part of this is that you want to detail in your plan how this threat assessment team is actually activated. Most commonly, threats would come up through one of those groups that are listed above. And so whether it's HR or security, or maybe it's somebody actually in EAP, they have a threat and how they can actually escalate it up through the team. So you want to detail how is it going to be activated. And these people need to be trained in that activation process. Ideally, they are all loaded onto your emergency notification system, so a threat is received, a notice can go out, and people can immediately jump on a bridge. You also want to make sure as part of this threat assessment team that you actually identify how it connects with your regular assessment team if you have one, and also your overall crisis management process. And they should really be hand in glove and working together, both in exercises and of course in a real incident. A few more things to consider about your threat assessment team. You want to make sure that they understand kind of what the problems are like already at your company. And you may say, well, gosh, Regina, we don't have any problems at our company. And I would say, I'll guess again. All you have to do is probably talk to 2 departments in your firm, and you're going to find out all kinds of things. Human resources would be one, and the second would be security. Find out what the history of threats are. And you'll be surprised that you'll hear about stalkings, domestic violence, you'll hear about employee threats. And so learn about what your history is so that you can be smart. In your plan for the threat assessment team, you also want to spell out everybody's role and their responsibility. Basically, who does what, and when do they do it, and again, how are they activated? This is important, not just because everybody needs to be trained in this, but you might have somebody who's filling in for somebody else. An incident occurs, and they're not sure exactly what to do. It's also important that you really educate all of these 10 members about the issue of workplace violence. There is tremendous amounts of research now done on this very significant topic, and having regular trainings and educational opportunities for members so that they can sit around a table when a threat comes and they can be smart. Lastly, for this team, you also want to make sure that you've engaged outside professionals. So whether that is psychologists to assess individuals' threat potential, or it is security officials to look at the security issues that might be within your business, you want to make sure that you've reached out and touched and have lined up, if you need them, these individuals who could be assistance to you in the time of a crisis and an impending threat. Number 3 is an important one, and that's reaching out to law enforcement in your local area. So your local police department, your sheriff, depending on where you're located. Your security department already might have that kind of relationship, but this is really expanding it really to look at this threat profile. The time to meet with your local law enforcement, as you know, is not in the middle of an incident. So reaching out to them now is really important. And it's not just simply introducing yourself and saying hi, it's sharing what you have. So I would be inclined to share my workplace violence plans, my emergency procedures. I would want them to have a copy of my floor plans. And if I was in a really large facility, and especially one that was, maybe like a manufacturing facility with lots of nooks and crannies, I would want to make sure that I gave them a good walkthrough so they could kind of understand what the issues might be if they were to come on my property at any particular time. Number 4, what we want to do is we want to actually include active shooter situations in our emergency response plans. Very interestingly enough, right now I've been designing an emergency exercise for one of our clients, and it's about an active shooter. And one of the concerns that they've expressed to me is the HR department doesn't want to talk about with employees what they should do. And I think to myself, you've got to be kidding me. Who else should be telling them what they should be doing? Individuals need to know right now what they're expected to do when an active shooter situation occurs. So the key thing you want to be talking about in your plans are very short. And I'm sure all of you have seen the Houston film Run, Hide, Fight. Those are the three things that we're teaching in any emergency response training. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are in order, meaning that you run first and then you hide and then you fight. It could be some combination of those. So they are not linear, but indeed whatever is appropriate given the situation that you're faced with. Certainly showing the run, hide, fight video that we're all familiar with is an excellent source, but then also really reviewing this in detail with employees and just talking about it in a matter-of-fact fashion so they're not anxious or they're not, I've never heard what they should do. We also encourage families to have the same conversation around the dinner table at home, showing the run, hide, fight video, which you can find on YouTube, and having that same kind of conversation with every family member, so if it ever occurs to them, they understand that there are options and that they should be thinking about those options when the situation occurs. Number 5, you want to train your employees and your company on the workplace violence policy and the plan and the active shooter. So now that you've written a plan and a policy, you've got a threat assessment team, you've connected with local law enforcement, and you have written emergency procedures, now we have to share them. Because if you're the only one that knows about them, it's not very helpful. So 2 types of training. The first is employee training. We strongly advocate that you review your workplace violence policy. So detailing what's unacceptable behavior, what kind of language is unacceptable. Detail the policy and be very explicit so that people understand if they hear something, if they themselves are threatened, or if they hear someone else who's been threatened or aware of an unsafe situation, they know if they've crossed the line and they know what to do. You also want to discuss how incidents are going to be managed. So who investigates? Who comes back and keeps the person informed who reported the threat? How is that handled? Are you going to say who actually told them? All of those things are what people are going to want to hear from you, so be prepared to discuss them. You want to look for and how to report, as I've talked about, and then the whole issue of how that process works is very important. And then you want to discuss the emergency response procedures that we just talked about. Run, hide, fight. But also, one of the things that we do when we do this type of training is we also talk about how to deal with difficult people. Because many times you can actually de-escalate a situation if you have some just basic skills. And many of us just don't have them. I've never been taught, don't know. So emergency response, but also how to deal with difficult people can be very helpful in managing an incident. The second type of employee training is really important, and it's really about managers. And you may say, so why do we have to train managers differently? Well, because often they're the ones that are dealing with these individuals, and often, especially in cases of employees who are being terminated or are going through a progressive discipline, managers need to have a very good understanding about the policies and the plans. So you want to review the policy, you want to talk through the plan and the emergency procedures. But then what we want to do is we want to educate them a bit about human behavior. Recognizing signs and symptoms that might be concerning. Maybe people have suddenly become very isolationistic. Maybe they've been talking a lot about kind of dark topics at work. Maybe they've been under a lot of pressure at home and the pressure at work is just more than they can bear. So understanding signs and symptoms of what to look for could be helpful. It's also important that managers really deeply understand the psychology of job loss, especially when they are faced with terminating employees. If you stop and think about it, when you're introduced to somebody, when you introduce yourself, that you always say your name, and then inevitably people always ask you, what do you do? In our society, jobs are extremely important, and they identify who we are. To lose a job, whether you're laid off or fired, can be very psychologically damaging. So it's important that managers, especially who are dealing with terminations or changing layoffs, understand the psychology of job loss. It's also important that you clearly review all the interventions that are available to assist employees. So whether that's something that might be in the HR department, there might be trainings that are available within your training department that can deal with things like loss or support or psychological assistance. What about your employee assistance program? What kind of benefits do you have for your employees in that regard? And if you don't have an EAP, are there other sources that you might be able to refer people to? You want to be able to give some guidance to folks if they need it. And then lastly, I'd like to say that I think it's important to stop and reflect the importance of instinct. There's something I'm sure you've heard called the gift of fear, which is a gut reaction. I had the great privilege of attending a one-week training about 10 years ago from Gavin DeBecker, who's out of Los Angeles, and he wrote the book, The Gift of Fear. And he talks at length about the importance of paying attention. So that if you're in a situation and your gut, and we all know what that means, your gut reaction, if your gut tells you that something is wrong, one thing that's very interesting about most humans is that we have a tendency to disregard it. Our brain kicks in, and that's kind of dangerous when that happens. Our brain kicks in and says things like, well, that would never happen, or gee, that's kind of silly of me. And in Gavin's research in particular, he talks about people who have been brutally assaulted, raped, awful things have happened to them, and they say eminently they knew not to walk down that street. They felt that incredible gift of fear, but yet they immediately talked themselves into doing it anyway. So I would highly encourage all of you to look at Gavin's work. It's very inspirational and insightful. And then lastly, when you're doing manager training, it's really helpful to do scenarios or interactive training that will really enhance the learning potential for these individuals. So whether you're doing role playing, or you're doing little scenarios where you're talking about people acting out or customers coming in or vendors being outraged, whatever it is, practice 3 or 4 different scenarios where people have to work through those things, possibly in small groups, not necessarily in front of an audience, but in small groups so they can work through the language, the behavior, and how they might actually manage the event. Number 6 out of my 7. Deploy an emergency notification system and conduct an exercise with all of your staff. ENSs are extremely important in any type of emergency. But in a workplace violence, active shooter, oh my gosh, there's no replacement for it. Your emergency notification system is literally the most critical tool you have to communicate to people in an active shooter. But this means that you've actually done something with it. You just don't have it, but you've worked through it. So you've got groups in place. So whether you have, many of my clients will say, gee, we just dumped all of our employees in and we're just going to send them an email or a notification when something happens. Well, that's not bad, but it's not great. You could put them into more appropriate groups. So whether you do it by floors or whether you do it by buildings or departments, are they segmented in some way so you could communicate with people more effectively? Pre-written templates, I've talked about that earlier. I cannot emphasize enough how important those are. You don't have time to write something out, and you don't have time to get it approved by legal, gosh forbid. All you've got is time to basically get out the message. And then lastly, you've got to practice. Most of our clients will do an exercise once a year. I think once a year is good, twice is better. Most employees aren't very familiar with an ENS, and so when they get the message, they may not know what to do with it. They might think it's a hoax. And so it's important that you train people. The other thing I'd like to say about an ENS is that it's only as good as the information you've entered. So if your information from your employees is not current, you don't have a cell phone, but you've got an office phone number, that's not going to help if the person is hiding in a closet. So you want to make sure that you've got different tools, different means to connect. So you want to make sure you have a valid cellular device, whether it's an office-owned one or a personal one. You want to make sure that you've got emails, both home and at work. You want to make sure you have their home phone in there, and of course their office. So you have lots of options, but make sure the information is current. And then lastly, what you want to do is you want to conduct an active shooter exercise with your incident or crisis management team that focuses on the aftermath. And notice the key word in this slide, aftermath. When you stop and think about it, during an active shooter incident, all that's going on is emergency response. That's all it is. It's emergency response. So that means a couple of things. One, we're depending solely on the way you train people and what you told them to do in the emergency response procedures, which is so important. And then secondly, who's in charge are the emergency responders, primarily law enforcement. But once the incident is over, the smoke is cleared, your company needs to pick up the pieces, and they have to deal with the impact. That's with your employees, that's with your customers, and that's with your overall community. And that is all about impact. So with an incident or crisis management team exercise, the clock should really start, if you will, what we call the exercise clock when we design exercises, is really after the incident is over. The perpetrator is either removed or killed. And what you're focusing on really is the aftermath and the impact. And the key areas for you to think about is, how would you be assisting or managing your employees? Oh my gosh, there are a zillion things to think about. What about the human resources aspect of this? What about communication and all the social media related issues? What about business continuity? And what about brand and reputational impact to your business? And I'll give you a great example of this. Many years ago, our first case of workplace violence was in 2003, and it was a case here in San Francisco called 101 Market. And the building 101 Market was, excuse me, 101 California, 101 California. That particular building housed a large law firm, the third largest in the state of California, Pettit & Martin. And they had a case of workplace violence where a man came in and actually killed 9 people on 2 floors. The organization, one of our clients, they actually did all the right stuff. They did counseling, they remodeled their floors, they did all of this in an effort to really help people get over it. But interestingly enough, a year later, they could not psychologically overcome the impact of those murders, and they actually went out of business. And part of it was a huge brand and reputation impact. People didn't want to go there, and clients didn't want to have them as lawyers. And they just could not overcome that. So the brand and reputation impact is huge, and the impact to your employees and the impact to business continuity plans. Because people aren't just going to willy-nilly open up their BCP and go to work. They're going to be incapacitated for a period of time. And how do you continue the business when that's happened? So under next steps, I would really say to you this, and that is, please take this threat seriously. We are not being warmongers, if you will, by bringing up such an important topic. It's critically important, especially this day in society. As Imad showed you in the studies, there are increasing cases of active shooters. There's one almost every day in America. I encourage you to think about these 7 steps that I've shared with you and really share them with your senior management and ask the question, what the heck are we going to do? And then you want to develop a work plan. You want to make really clear assignments and a timeline for getting all of these 7 things done. And you really want to get going because time really is of the essence. So now I'd like to send it back to Imad, who's going to talk a little bit about some communication principles as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Regina. Very, very insightful. And I'm seeing that there are some really good questions and comments that are coming in via the chat window. So please keep them coming. We'll go over them as soon as this particular section is done. And some of them are some pretty interesting and fairly long and insightful comments. So hopefully we'll have time to go over them in detail. But one thing that I wanted to talk to you about is the overall Everbridge approach. So I've mentioned some of the concerns that certainly came through from the overall survey, the disconnect between the perception and the challenges, some of the great best practices that Regina talked about. So how are there tools, are there solutions that can allow you to handle them, to deal with them? So let's talk about the overall high-level Everbridge approach. It really deals with 4 buckets: assess, locate, automate, and then communicate. So let's talk about that first bucket, the first phase, the assessment. Part of what you want to have access to is the information that's needed to determine if there is an issue, to determine the likelihood, the severity, the impact. And this information can come in from a variety of different sources. For example, do you have the ability to collect from your employees, regardless of where they may be, whether it's in a particular building, around the city, around the county, around the state, or around the world? Do you have the ability to capture information from them if they report suspicious activity, if they report an act of violence, or if they've been suspected? Do you have the ability to manage and analyze information coming in from many employees and then make a determination, whether manually or automatically, and alert the right people within security or a threat assessment team, for example, as Regina mentioned? So that's part of what the assessment is. But one thing to remember is that an active shooter incident doesn't have to be inside your building to affect your business, to affect your organization, to affect your employees, or to affect your citizens. If it's happening across the street, or in the neighborhood, or in a different store or a different floor, that still has an impact on you. So you have to think outside of just your four walls. So how do you get information that is coming in from the outside world as well? It could be in social media. It could be from public safety agencies that are in your area, that have jurisdiction over your place of business, for example, or that might be adjacent to yours. Can that information come in, and without having to have somebody always watching the news or watching a screen, automatically let you know, let the threat assessment team, let the security operations center know that there is an issue that requires their immediate attention? That's where the assessments come in. That's how you can then make the appropriate decisions. And here, seconds count, minutes count. The sooner you have access to this information, that can be automatically analyzed, automatically categorized, and can trigger the appropriate workflows to let the people who are in charge know that there is a situation that requires their attention, the better. So that's the assessment piece. Let's talk about one of the most important pieces then, right? When we looked at your challenges, what you said was your second biggest challenge was locating people who may be in an impacted building or facility. So that's why that second stage for us is to locate. Now here, we're not just talking about locating the people who may be impacted. Generally speaking, in any type of incident, you have three buckets of people that you have to locate. You've got your responders, you've got your impacted personnel, and then you've got the key stakeholders that have to stay informed. Who are they? So, and in this case, you're dealing with geographic location, who's in a building, who's supposed to be working here, who lives in the area. You may have what we call expected location. Was there somebody who was in transit to this building? Was there somebody from another city who was flying in? I need to be able to account for them. I need to make sure that I'm communicating with them. And then I have to be able to make sure that I'm locating my responders. Who's on duty? Who's got the right skill sets to be of use or help during a situation like this? Who are the people who are part of the threat assessment team and who happen to be on call right now? Who are the managers that need to be informed of a situation based potentially on the location, on the scope, on the impact? Were there customers at that time in the location or the facility or not? Was this one of our employees or not? The ability to identify the responders, to identify impacted personnel, to identify key stakeholders is incredibly important. Using information such as where are people assigned to work, using information about their last known location, who badged into the building, using travel itineraries to know whether people are supposed to be in this location or not. All of those can come together to give you a sense for who might be impacted and who might be available to help. In addition to that, if you have additional information about your employees, such as their special needs, well, what happens if you have people who cannot self-evacuate, people who are mobility limited? Can you identify those very quickly by using not just their last known location, but also the fact that they've self-identified as needing help? Because in that particular case, your process has to be able to include how to deal with them and help them evacuate in that particular case. So again, who's in harm's way, who can help, who needs to stay informed, all of that needs to happen as quickly as possible before you move on to the next step, which is the automation step. So again, this happens to be the third issue that you talked to us about. So during a location-specific active shooter incident, your third biggest challenge or concern was to make a decision. Who gets to make a decision? Whether to initiate a building lockdown, shelter in place, an evacuation. Well, as Regina said, as you're putting together a plan, you better have everything worked out, or as much as possible, including the message templates. So here, the third step that we talk about is the automation step. Do you have a plan? Do you have a standard operating procedure? Do you have a policy? Do you have best practices? All of those can be built in. Have you identified, for example, who needs to be contacted and escalated to depending on the severity of a situation? So by automating your appropriate plans, all you have to do when you find out that there is a workplace violence incident or an active shooter is have the operator, the person on duty at the time, the person who's actually activating the process, all they have to do is give the minimal amount of information that's needed. For example, for a particular campus, it may be, just tell me the building where the issue is happening, or just tell me the floor. And then the system, based on your best practices, your standard operating procedures, your plan, can use that little bit of information that was provided by the operator, additional information such as time of day, day of week, to make the appropriate decisions behind the scene. Now, these are your decisions, and it's simply executing those decisions. It's making a decision, for example, to send a message that was pre-crafted and filling in the blanks based on, again, time of day or the building that was entered by the operator. It's going to automatically identify the people who are the responders. It may look at calendars and look at their availability and look at the skill sets and who's assigned as a threat assessment team for this particular city or building or region. It's going to identify those people who might be in harm's way by looking at who's assigned to this building or this floor or this area, by looking at whose last known location is in this area, because we've looked at a variety of different factors that give us a chance and an opportunity to see who's where. It will also identify the appropriate people who have to be kept in the loop. All of those great best practices that Regina talked about can be put together and automated as part of this process. All you have to do is enter in the minimal amount of information that is required, click on go, and you're good to go. And then it's about the communication. That was the top issue that you told us about. Your top challenge, your top concern, communicating with people who might be impacted. And again, that's that last step. The automation can help notify employees, notify the threat assessment team, notify the incident response team, notify all the stakeholders. Give them instructions as to what to do. Deal with the aftermath. Assess who needs help and who doesn't. Create the automatic muster lists. And it can do it by calling people on their cell phones, sending them texts, sending them push notifications, lighting up displays that might be connected within your building. 100 different ways of sending out messages. And again, this needs to be two-way. Two-way. You need to get responses back to know who's safe and who needs help. But you also need, in some cases, to simply allow certain people to report issues, even if you're not initiating that communication. And that needs to happen on a global basis if you happen to be a global company. I think that one of the questions that I saw going by was around different protocols that may be different around the world. And yes, that ability to automate may give you the ability to tweak what your processes and your protocols might be based on where in the world the incident is happening. Same thing with communication. I may have to communicate differently with different people based on where they are. So that's what the 4 steps are. You start with assessing the situation, locating the right people, whether they're the people who are in harm's way or the people who can actually help and respond or the people who need to stay informed. You automate your processes so that all those wonderful plans can be executed at the push of a button with minimal interaction from the person who's going to push a button, and again, to ensure that no mistakes are made. And ultimately, to communicate with all of the various stakeholders.
All right, thank you, Imad. At this point, we are going to open it up for questions. We've got a bunch in so far, but please don't hesitate to send in any more. As a reminder, you can submit your questions in by typing a question into the open text field in the questions panel on your screen. So first question we got just came in from Lauren in the audience, Imad. How does Everbridge allow two-way communication for SMS texting and can a recipient send a confirmation text?
Yes, a confirmation text can be sent back. So there are really 2 ways of doing two-way communications. You can have a simple acknowledgement. So I'm sending out the notification. It can go over SMS or over email with a simple acknowledgement. So anything you simply type acknowledges that you've actually seen the message. So typically people will just respond with yes. Or it could be a polling notification. So a polling notification is a multiple choice question. It can have up to 9 responses. Typically we'll suggest having 3, right? I need help, I'm safe, or I'm not in the area, something like that. And what people can do when it's SMS is simply respond with 1, 2, or 3, depending on what the choices are. Same thing if they actually get a phone call, they'll simply press 1, 2, or 3. We try to keep it consistent, and all of these interactions are generated automatically by the Everbridge solution.
All right. Next question is for you, Regina. Comes from Wendell in the audience. He says, when I wrote my dissertation on workplace violence several years ago, domestic situations at work seemed to be the key event that employers were concerned about. It appears now that there is more concern about unknown shooters. Do you find that to be the case?
That's a great question. We find in our client population that the majority of active shooter situations that they have experienced have been people that are known to them. They have been terminated employees, they have been cases of workplace violence, and they have also been disgruntled customers. So in our experience, it has been known perpetrators, which goes back to, again, the importance of having a really good plan, process, and training so that when these threats begin to bubble up, you actually can begin to try and manage them to the best of your ability.
All right, thank you, Regina. I got one more for you from William in the audience. What is the best way to go about getting buy-in from senior leadership for a full-scale active shooter exercise?
That's a great question. Let me just talk for a moment about active shooter exercises. I have mixed feelings about them. I think that there are 2 environments where having a real active shooter situation training with law enforcement, guns drawn, make a lot of sense. One of them is in schools, and the second of them is in healthcare situations, emergency departments in particular. Those 2 lend themselves to that type of training much more effectively. In an office environment where you've got multiple floors, large platforms, it's not as effective a tool, and I've actually had several clients who have done them. Now, we didn't thankfully do them for them, but they went very poorly, and part of it was in the area of people's response, their anxiety. They had employees who actually literally, one had a heart attack. It was not good. So what I've experienced and seen is that for schools, healthcare facilities, makes perfect sense. I think the best thing that you can do within an office or business environment is really solid training, and then really focusing your exercises more on impact.
All right, thank you, Regina. Next question we have is from Dennis in the audience. Going to pose it to both you and Imad. Most fire drills involve assembly areas where employees congregate in a safe area away from the fire. Congregating in a large group could be hazardous given an active shooter incident. Is there any recommendation on this or current procedures to circumvent this hazard? You can take that first.
Yeah. I'm happy to start off on that. So in the case of an active shooter situation, you're not going to go to an assembly area. People are going to run for their lives, which is totally appropriate. You don't want to place them in a situation where they could be at harm's way. So in a active shooter training, I would suggest that people leave the building. Hopefully they have a device with them in their hand or pocket, so when they're reached by an ENS, they'll be able to respond, but to not assemble. And then to also encourage them that they need to communicate back to the management of their company as to how they're doing, where they are, if they're okay, because many people are going to be only thinking about, first of all, their body, their own personal well-being, and secondarily, they're going to be thinking about their family, and they're not going to be thinking about their job.
So, and let me reiterate a part of Regina's answer, and this is, again, we need to think about that entire plan, right? It's not just about letting people know, hey, it's time to evacuate or run or whatnot. Right? When you're communicating in time of a crisis, you have to communicate through multiple stages. There's the initial, here's the instruction, go do this. But you also have that next stage, the update. You've got the all clear. And at some point in time, just let people go, but make sure that you can communicate with them to see, have you evacuated safely? Are you safe? Do you need help, etc. By having your plan include those steps, by having that bi-directional communication, by having the ability to report back and have actionable reports. I can see very quickly once I've sent out the notification how many people I haven't heard back from, because then I need to concentrate on just those. So I need to follow up with just those who either say they need help or those who say nothing, in order to be able to ensure whether I have to go and send people in harm's way to track them down, or whether there is a different reason why they're not answering. What that allows you to do is simply not have to do the old-fashioned manual mustering where everybody has to congregate in an area so you can count them and see that they're safe. They can go anywhere. They can be, having a coffee at a Starbucks in that particular case and telling you once they get that message that they're safe. So again, make sure that your plan includes all of those stages that go beyond that initial, hey, we've got a problem.
Let me just also build on Imad's comments that that is such a huge plus of an ENS system, is that you can literally find quickly how people are doing and you can really redirect your energy. So it's a huge point to be made about an ENS system.
All right, next question I have for you, Regina, from Sandro in the audience. What is the best practice when implementing a global program for workplace violence prevention? He gives the example of, let's say they have 60 sites in 40+ countries globally.
That's a really great question. And then what you have to do is you have to really tailor the training and the responses that you're looking for to the country and the culture that you're dealing with. So in America, there's a certain style that we might have that might be appropriate in both training and in procedures, where it may not be so because of cultural concerns around the country, around the world. So I think what I would suggest is this, is that you start perhaps if the mothership of the company is in the United States or wherever the mothership resides, you start with a program that fits that particular culture. And then I think what you need to do is then take that plan, that communication strategy as well, and then you need to go to each different country and really have a discussion with management, HR, legal, to make sure that the training is appropriate, that it's correctly nuanced, not too, too American or too West or whatever, so that it basically communicates what it needs to, but it does it in the culturally sensitive way. It might take you a little bit longer to do that, but I think you'd probably have a far better program than just having a one-size-fits-all approach.
This is Imad. Let me emphasize the cultural differences that might be there. Please, please, please do not assume that one size fits all. Philosophies are going to be different. Regulations are going to be different. We have an approach at Everbridge that we call globally local. That is the ability to think globally, to have global management and oversight and control, but to have that local insight, to have that local awareness, to have the local look and feel, whether it's the tool or the regulations that you adhere to. And that's built into our solutions across the board. Let's take a very simple example from a cultural approach perspective. You've heard Regina talk about run, hide, fight. Well, that tends to be, generally speaking, a North America-centric view of the world when it comes to active shooters. In other countries, it might be run, hide, tell, would be what you'd see plastered all over the place. So in many cases, you get quite a bit of pushback if you try to impose a North America-centric approach that may not be compatible with the local culture or the local mores. So for us, it goes all the way down to the way that we communicate with people. The way that you have to send out an SMS in India is going to be different from the way that you do it in the US. There are different regulations that are at play that regulate how you need to deal with it, do not disturb registries, etc. All of that is incredibly important, and it's under this philosophy that we call globally local.
All right, thank you. We are running a little long. I want to get to just a couple more questions here. One of the last questions we have, do you have any suggestions to overcome HR's reluctance to tackle this issue, currently being faced with flat refusal because they don't want to scare people?
I'll take a stab at that. I've heard that from several of our clients over the years, and it's mind-boggling to me that you would have that as an approach from any HR professional. However, understanding that that does exist out there, I think I would maybe try and do a couple of different things. I would assemble a certain amount of research on the number of active shooter cases, probably pull out some of the good FBI information and Department of Homeland Security on active shooter. And then if I fail to make any progress on the HR front, what I would probably try and do then is to then work through my executive sponsor and see if I could get up above that food chain, if you will, and talking to other senior executives of the organization to express my anxiety and concern about that, and just see if you could try another channel. Try the HR one, of course, but if it doesn't work, I think I would pursue another channel, possibly through facilities or security, and then see if there's another way you can sort of move around that person, and then it ends up being more from the top down.
All right, thank you, Regina. One final question here before we wrap up. It's from Elizabeth in the audience. How do you communicate with employees who may be hiding? Even if they have their cell phones, you don't want it ringing, because that may alert the shooter at that person's location.
So for us, we are strong believers in multimodal communications, right? There are always multiple ways of trying to get the message out. I mean, one of the things that is certainly key in many cases is when people are hiding that they'll set their phones on silent, etc. But again, we've seen multiple assessments as to how to actually communicate with people in these cases, especially if you've located the shooter and are inside a building and so on and so forth. So in some cases, people will actually, or systems like ours can use the PA system. They can use LCDs and other screens that display the message. They can send out a push notification that isn't going to have a sustained ring. They can send out an email and so on and so forth. So it all depends on the situation, which is why, again, having that automation of your plan, of your standard operating procedure is key, because there are many choices that need to be made, and you don't want to be making this choice in the midst of a crisis.
All right, thank you, Imad. And with that, we are going to wrap up. I want to thank Imad and Regina for a great webinar, and all of our attendees who were able to join us today. As a reminder, you will receive an email with a link to the recording and slides by the end of the week. And if you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us on Twitter @Everbridge and join our group on LinkedIn, Everbridge Incident Management and Emergency Notification Professionals. For those of you interested in requesting a demo of the Everbridge system, please visit everbridge.com/request-demo. Thank you all again for coming to today's session, and we hope to see you online again soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.